another session at the Everyone Deserves Summit. We are 7 hours into a 12-hour day of learning, and I, for one, am overwhelmed with joy at all that we've already learned today and very excited about our next speaker. So, Jessica Burylo came to us via social media, of all things. She landed on the Proof Positive page, commented, we commented back. And lo and behold, a few months later, she was on our advisory board. She is a brilliant autistic self-advocate who's a doctoral student in Alberta, Canada, interested in the topic of autistic joy and identity. I love talking to her. Her energy is joyful. She is a jolt of joy. And I know you will all love hearing more from her about what is autistic joy and how can we really center autistic joy in this conversation on well-being. Jess, over to you. We're so happy you're here.
Thank you. Oh, Katie, can you just like be in my bathroom every morning so the first thing I hear is just a pep talk from you? Thank you for that. Welcome. And thank you everyone for being here. Today, I specifically want to talk about this concept that comes up a lot in my doctoral research, but also just a lot in my life as an autistic person, which is autistic joy. So specifically, I want to explore how autistic joy challenges the way that our society measures worth. So many of us have been taught to think about autism from that deficit lens, right? The story of impairment, of tragedy, of limitation. But what happens if we start from somewhere else? What happens if we are looking at how autistic people actually live? How do we adapt to the world around us? How do we connect with each other? And ultimately, how do we experience joy? So that shift opens up a very different way of understanding autistic life. Well, there we go. So I'd actually like to open this presentation with a bit of a story. So I want you to imagine a girl growing up who feels slightly out of sync with the world around her. She has different interests and different passions. She carries herself differently. She expresses herself differently. Uh, but most of all, she's always just slightly out of step with the world. So she starts studying it. She studies how other kids talk and how they move and how they react to each other. She learns scripts so that she can participate in those conversations. And she watches carefully to imitate what seems to work. And she does. She pays close attention to the social feedback she receives. So she notices when things land badly, when people are laughing at her instead of with her, when she is bullied, when she is told that she's too strange or too intense. But she also notices when something works, when a joke lands, when a moment of connection seems possible. Teachers describe her as bright, um, maybe a little anxious, maybe a little sensitive. Sometimes she says that she tries too hard or not hard enough. Sometimes they say she's just too much, but she works very hard to keep up. Every day she's performing competence. She studies the cues around her to figure out what the world expects her to be. What kind of woman is she going to grow up to be? And she performs that normalcy to the best of her ability. But underneath that performance is this constant layer of exhaustion. She experiences sensory overload by entering spaces that society tells her she should be able to enter, like schools and grocery stores, concerts. She experiences social confusion when she feels especially certain that the world works one way, only to discover that it in fact does not. And over time, managing all of this becomes incredibly heavy. She might develop depression, anxiety, eating disorders, chronic fatigue. She may struggle to keep a job even though she is intelligent and capable. But being autistic, no, no one sees that. Despite everything she is navigating, autism is rarely suggested. Instead, it's a problem that is framed as something that lives within her, something that she needs to fix, something that she needs to manage, something that she needs to overcome. And yet, even within these difficult conditions, there are also moments of connection, when she dives deep into her interests and experiences a sense of focus and clarity, moments where she connects with people, moments when she even thinks that she likes the way that her brain works. And then one day into adulthood, maybe in her 20s or 30s or later, she receives an autism diagnosis. And it completely changes the way that she um, understands her entire self and her past. But along with that diagnosis comes language. Some of it that's very helpful. So she's able to reframe her challenges, reframe the way that she sees herself, reframe her strengths. But along with that is this narrative that she is suddenly defined by what she lacks. And that there is a tension between the way that she sees herself and the way that, say, doctors and clinicians see her. So I want to give an example of what this tension might look like. So we might recognize this man. Yes, we even talk about him up in Canada. If you don't know, his name is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and he is the United States Secretary of Health and Human Services. So this clip comes from a press conference that was held in April of last year after the CDC released new data showing increase in autism diagnoses among children in the United States. There are many elements of that press conference that we could examine and critique, and I would love to, but that's another talk. Um, but I really want to focus in on one specific line because I think this line reveals something important about how autistic lives are often talked about in public. So we were having some sound stuff with sharing the screen, so I can't play the video on the screen, but I have the video up elsewhere so that I'll be able to play the audio for you. So, and I hope that one of my support people will let me know if you ultimately can't hear it.
These are kids who will never pay taxes.
Oh,
These are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. And we have to recognize we are doing this to our children. And we need to put an end to it.
that's it. That's where the clip ends. I know we all want to hear the rest of it, don't we? But so statements like this they reflect a very familiar way of talking about autism. So autistic life is often framed through this narrative of crisis and tragedy and loss. And the underlying message is that autistic lives are valuable only if they resemble a certain idea of a normal life, one defined by independence and productivity and economic contribution, and for some reason, playing baseball. In other words, the question being asked is not simply what is autism, it's they're asking what kind of lives count as valuable. So when we listen closely, we begin to hear an assumption beneath many of these conversations of who in our society do we consider worthy. This is going to play the video. Here we go. So I'm going to take a break from my dramatic opening because before we go any further, I want to pause for a moment to just briefly explain where I'm going with this presentation. So in this talk, first, I want to take the idea that autistic lives are tragic and explore it a little bit further. I'm first going to look at why autistic lives are often framed in these terms in the first place. What are the assumptions about human worth that sit underneath those narratives? Then I'm going to talk about what autistic survival actually looks like within those conditions, particularly for autistic women and gender diverse individuals whose experiences have often been overlooked in research and diagnosis. And finally, I want to shift that conversation towards something that is much less discussed in academic and policy spaces, which is autistic joy. So, not joy, though, as naive optimism, not joy as the absence of struggle, but joy as a way that autistic people create meaning and connection and agency within environments that are often difficult to navigate. So, the journey we're going to take together today moves from deficit narratives to survival, and then finally, autistic joy as a way of rethinking what flourishing might look like. I'm also going to give a few quick notes on language. So you may have noticed so far I've been using identity first language because that's increasingly becoming the standard for community-led organizations here in Canada. But whether you are autistic or have autism, this presentation is still for you. And also, when I say women, I mean those who are assigned female at birth, those who are socialized as female, and gender diverse folk. There's an unfortunate lack of data about gender diverse autistic folk, but what we do know is that they experience similar or worse challenges than autistic women. And also, if some of the spelling looks a little weird, they're definitely not typos. No, no, I never do that. But they might be the Canadian spelling just because I'm representing up here. Back to the show. To understand why statements like the one you just heard are so common, we need to step back and look at the broader systems of values that shape how we think about human worth. So, in many societies, a person's value is strongly connected to productivity. We are encouraged to think about people as valuable when they are independent and efficient and economically productive. In other words, when they're able to work and support themselves and contribute to the economy. And this way of thinking doesn't just appear in one place, it shows up everywhere. We see it in public policy and in healthcare systems and in education, when, from your grandmother at Thanksgiving dinner, when she just continuously wants to know when you're going to bring home a doctor, and even how we talk about disability. So when RFK asks the question or questions the autistic ability to pay taxes and write a poem and play baseball, those statements may sound neutral, but underneath them is often another statement that autistic lives do not meet our standards of productivity. And though he was explicit in the way that he said it, that attitude is actually quite prevalent among the autism community. So, according to studies in Canada and the United States and the UK, the vast majority of research around autism is looking for, say, the biological cause or cures or ways to make folk act less autistic. Comparatively, very little money goes to research that improves the lives and the flourishing of autistic people. So the idea that human worth should be measured through productivity is closely connected to this political and economic framework known as neoliberalism. This is going to be your word of the day, neoliberalism. The idea that human worth is measured through productivity. It became influential in the late 20th century and promotes the ideas that individuals should be self-sufficient. They should be responsible for their own success, and they should be able to compete in the marketplace. And so this regularly lends to the idea that if you are not successful, if you are experiencing problems, if you have ill health, even, that this is your sole responsibility. And if you just pulled up your bootstraps a little bit, you should be able to do it. Where, of course, we know that this might not be the full story. I will pause and say that I know you came for a presentation about joy. And here I have a slide that says death, and I'm manipulating your emotions with this sad picture of a wilted flower. But I do think that in order for me to talk about joy, I have to first discuss the conditions in which joy emerges. So there's a term that, I guess your second word of the day, is slow death. So this comes from the feminist cultural theorist and philosopher Lauren Berlant. They describe slow death as this gradual wearing down of people's lives under social and economic conditions that demand constant endurance. So she specifically ties this to us living in this neoliberal society. the constant demand for productivity associated with our worth that we are solely and individually responsible for. So I will say that slow death, it's not a catastrophic event. It doesn't happen all at once like regular death. It's instead described as the way certain populations experience this slow erosion of health and stability and really possibility over time. And it's this accumulation of everyday pressures that gradually exhaust both people's bodies and their lives. So when Berlant was working with this concept, it originally was used to describe patterns that they observed in marginalized communities, particularly in the United States. So for example, they looked at how working class communities experience chronic health problems that are tied not just to individual behavior, but to the structural conditions in which they live. In these contexts where people are expected to keep working, keep managing, and keep surviving under these conditions that are steadily wearing them down. So life continues, but within these constant conditions of constraint. Berlant also connects slow death to the way that societies organize care and responsibility. So, under systems that emphasize individual responsibility, like neoliberalism, people are often told that their well being is something that they must manage on their own. And if they are struggling, the assumption is often that they just need to work harder. They just need to adapt better. They just need to be more resilient. But slow death starts to help us see that the issue has these structural components, not just individual ones. And there are certain groups of people that are living under conditions that make exhaustion pretty much inevitable. Lauren Berlant gives us hope, though, because even within these constraining systems, they are describing how people are not simply passive. I think about it like in a pinball machine. So we're the balls and we are bouncing around, and each new ding of light, each new bumper is these external effects on our body. But at the end of the day, with a pinball machine, you still have the flippers. So you still have some control in where the ball goes. So Berlant and others remind us that people are constantly finding ways to adapt and respond to make life possible within difficult conditions. So Berlant describes this as agency within constraint. And the idea that even when choices are limited, people are still actively navigating and negotiating and shaping their lives in meaningful ways. So rather than seeing people as being only acted upon by systems, we can also begin to see the ways that we are acting within those systems. So I am often these days asking the question of what does slow death look like as autistic slow death? And what would the autistic agency within constraint be? So one of the clearest places that we see slow death is within autistic burnout. And in some ways, this is like regular burnout, but it starts to operate at a whole different level. So autistic burnout describes a state of profound exhaustion that can emerge only after long periods of navigating environments that are not designed for autistic ways of being. It often includes things like chronic fatigue, reduced tolerance to sensory input, and difficulty performing tasks that were previously manageable. This is supported by literature, but also many autistic people describe losing skills or capacities that they once had simply because the effort of sustaining everyday life has become so heavy. So research suggests that a very large portion of autistic adults experience burnout at some point in their lives. And it appears particularly common among autistic women and gender diverse folk. But here we're talking about burnout under this neoliberal lens of productivity. So here, burnout is often interpreted as the individual problem, as though someone simply needs better coping strategies or greater resilience. But many autistic scholars and activists argue that burnout is better understood as a structural outcome. It emerges when people are expected to function continuously in environments that demand social performance and sensory tolerance and productivity without providing the conditions that even make those things sustainable in the first place. So this idea also connects to another concept from disability studies, which is called debility. So this was developed by Jasper Puar. Um, so debility describes situations where people are kept functioning just enough to participate in society. And in a capitalist society, it's usually that you're kept functioning just enough to work, but under conditions that gradually wear us down. So that sure sounds a lot like slow death to me. In other words, people may appear high functioning, but that apparent functioning is often sustained through enormous effort and long-term exhaustion. So I'm relying on the argument here that from this perspective, autistic burnout is not simply personal collapse, but rather a predictable outcome living under these conditions that continuously demand adaptation without providing adequate support. So we know autistic burnout is more prominent in autistic women and gender diverse folk. And there's another big component to their existence that contributes to this. Masking. So one important part of this answer lies in how, oh, excuse me, we're not at masking yet. I should read the slides when I go to the slides, shouldn't I? So we're talking about why burnout is so common among autistic women and gender diverse folk. And I think one important part of the answer lies in how autism has been historically defined. So when autism was first described in the mid-20th century by Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger, the children they studied were overwhelmingly boys. And though some advancements have happened over the last 100 years or so, autism research today is still overwhelmingly on autistic boys. Because of this, the early diagnostic picture of autism was built primarily around male presentations. So in this model, autism was typically associated with social withdrawal and emotional restraint and intense focus on special interests. And of course, that is part of the autistic experience, but it does not capture the full diversity of the autistic experience. And there's another really important layer here, and that is medicine itself has a long history of gender bias. So across many areas of healthcare, women's symptoms are more likely to be interpreted as emotional and psychological rather than neurological and physiological. So even when women present very similar autistic traits to their male counterparts, they are often given different explanations. Instead of autism, they may receive diagnoses like anxiety, depression, or borderline personality disorder. And because of this bias, even when women present the same traits as their male counterparts, they're still more likely to be given different diagnoses. And I will say that these biases are very much not neutral, this erasure of women and gender diverse folk within the autism conversation. These systems that contribute to misdiagnoses and delayed diagnoses, and I will say that some studies show that as much as 80% of autistic women do not receive diagnoses until over the age of 18 or no diagnoses at all. So autistic women are more likely to fall into this neoliberal productivity narrative that they are the individual problems. So emotional and so difficult and just too much, right? So without the correct framework for understanding these experiences, many people also grow up without appropriate support. Research shows that autistic women experience higher rates of depression and anxiety and eating disorders. They also are more likely to experience violence and victimization, particularly in interpersonal relationships. And this is compared to not just non-autistic women, but also their autistic male counterparts. So here the issue is not simply diagnostic accuracy, but it's a women's issue, and it's a gender non-conforming folks issue about well-being and safety and ultimately access to support. So when autistic people are not recognized, they are often left navigating enormous challenges without the language and understanding and resources that will help them. And so there is one other big factor that contributes to this outcome in autistic women, which I've already let out of the bag, but maybe a bunch of you knew this already. Masking. So one reason autism can be particularly difficult to recognize in women and gender diverse people is because of masking. So for those of you who don't know, masking refers to the strategies that autistic people use to appear more neurotypical. So this might include things like rehearsing conversations ahead of time, or copying someone else's social behavior. You might suppress your stimming or other forms of self-regulation that would draw attention to yourself. And for many people, masking isn't really a choice, but it's this way of navigating environments where difference is not well understood or accepted. And in that sense, masking can be incredibly effective. It can help people avoid stigma, and it can help them build relationships, get through job interviews. It can help them move through spaces that might otherwise feel inaccessible, but it often comes at a significant cost. So masking requires constant monitoring of one's own behavior. When you're constantly thinking about what to say, how to move, how to respond, and over time, that level of effort becomes exhausting. Sounding familiar? And in many cases, masking creates the illusion that someone is coping well, even when they're struggling internally. And so from the outside, things may look fine, but underneath, there's this significant amount of strain where we see the higher the masking, the higher the rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidality. And this is one of the ways that we begin to see how invisibility and adaptation and exhaustion all are becoming deeply connected. So we know that masking is associated with higher levels of exhaustion and mental health distress, but I want to suggest that this isn't the whole story. Traditionally, masking has been understood as a problem. It often is framed as a symptom of pathology, something that is harmful and inauthentic, or evidence that the person is struggling. And to be clear, masking can be really, really harmful. Read the past slide. But we've already talked about this connection, right, between exhaustion and burnout. But I want to pause here and ask whether this framing is complete. Because when we think back to the systems we've just discussed, this male model of autism, the broader patterns of gender bias, this neoliberal productivity lens, we can start to see why masking is emerging in the first place. That when autism is defined through a narrow lens, traits that don't fit the model don't just go unrecognized, they're often interpreted as problems within their own right. So in this context, masking begins to look less like a personal failing and more like the response to being misunderstood. Feminist scholars and disability theorists have long encouraged us to think more carefully about how people adapt within different or unequal systems. Because sometimes what looks like compliance is not simply compliance, but it's also this form of survival. So when people are navigating environments that were not designed for them, adaptation can be a way of maintaining safety and connection. From this perspective, masking can be understood not only as something imposed on autistic people, but also something actively developed. So many autistic people actually build highly sophisticated strategies to navigate social environments and manage expectation and ultimately reduce the harm that's on them. And recognizing that matters because it starts to challenge this idea that autistic folks are just wholly bags of deficits. We are not passive subjects being shaped by diagnosis, but we are also active agents in this, navigating complex and often challenging conditions. So returning back to Lauren Berlant's concept of agency within constraint, moving away from the narrative of autism as purely deficit focused, we're starting to see how this is painting a more multi-dimensional picture of who autistic people are and what we're capable of within our constraint. So all of these shifts bring us to an important question, and that is who gets to define autism? Historically, autism has been defined primarily by clinicians and researchers. These definitions have shaped our diagnostic criteria and our research agendas and our public understanding and press conferences at the White House. But as we've seen, those definitions are not neutral. They reflect particular perspectives, often rooted in deficit-based thinking and these productivity norms. In recent years, autistic people themselves have been increasingly challenging this arrangement. Why do they get to decide who defines what autism is? So, autistic scholars and advocates and community members were coming together and arguing that lived experience is a really crucial form of knowledge. Not something to be studied, but something that can actively shape how autism is interpreted and understood. And when we begin to take autistic perspectives seriously, something really interesting happens. There's new ways of understanding autistic life that begin to emerge, not just in terms of struggle and deficit, but in terms of meaning and connection and value, that the autistic experience is a valid source of philosophical insight. And one of the concepts that comes out of the shift is something that we don't hear nearly enough about. Hey, we got there. So this brings us to the concept that is the center of this work, that is autistic joy. So cue manipulating your emotions again, but this time with colorful happy flowers. Um, I do want to note, though, that with autistic joy, there is currently no accepted community-led definition of autistic joy, though it is widely used in the community. As my really charming supervisor loves to say, that if you put autistic joy into Google Scholar, you'll get like 3 articles that mention it in passing, and then a whole bunch of articles about autism written by somebody named Joy. But for the purpose of this talk, here's how I'm going to define it. So, autistic joy refers to forms of pleasure and connection and meaning that arise through autistic ways of being. That these are not just things that exist in spite of autism, but things that emerge through it. This can include experiences like a deep focus on special interests or sensory enjoyment, stimming and movement, connection with other autistic people. And these moments are often deeply regulating. They're so engaging and they are meaningful to many of us. They are frequently overlooked or misunderstood. Uh, or when they are, they're still used within these deficit-based frameworks of productivity. So they might be dismissed as repetitive or trivial or even problematic. But from another perspective, these are not just coping mechanisms, but they are valid and valuable ways of relating to the world. And I want to be really clear here that recognizing autistic joy does not mean ignoring real challenges that many autistic people face. But like anybody, autistic people are multidimensional, where struggle and joy can exist at the same time. So this is also where the political dimension of autistic joy becomes especially visible. Because up to this point, we've been talking about how autistic life is often framed through that deficit, limitation, and tragedy. But autistic joy disrupts that. When autistic people are celebrating their identities and building community and sharing experiences of joy, which we're totally out here doing, they're not just expressing something personal, but we're starting to challenge a dominant narrative. The narrative that says autistic life is something to be fixed and managed and mourned or cured. In that sense, joy is not neutral, but it's political because it interrupts the assumption that autistic life is inherently tragic. It pushes back against systems that define value through productivity and normalcy. And it asserts something different, that autistic ways of being are valuable within their own right. So joy in this context is not just a feeling, but it's a form of resistance. And to experience and express joy in a world that tells you your life is a problem, that's a political act. And I do want to say that up to this point, I've been talking about joy as an active force among autistic people within the autism community, but it is not just a responsibility that I think should solely live on the shoulders of autistic people. But if we want this to be a powerful movement, it needs to come from our wider community, our caregivers, our clinicians, the people that care about our well-being, to also celebrate our joy, not as something trivial or cute, but as something that's incredibly powerful. So up to this point, when we've been talking about Berland's idea of slow death to understand how systems are gradually wearing people down, and we've talked about agency within constraint, so the flippers on the pinball machine, the ways that people are adapting and enduring and that make life possible within those conditions, right? So I want to take that idea one step further, because sometimes these everyday actions don't just help people survive, they're also beginning to disrupt the systems and the narratives that constrain us. So I refer to this as interruptive agency. And by that, I mean small, ordinary actions that push back against the idea that certain lives are less valuable. And they're not necessarily dramatic or not always visible acts of resistance, but they're often quiet and everyday practices. Things like stimming in public, expressing autistic identity, creating art, building communities, or engaging in mutual care, in interdependence. Or I will say, having an entire conference around happiness and autism. So big shout out to Proof Positive for that. These acts may seem really small, but they absolutely matter. These actions are interruptive because they're challenging and reshaping how our current systems understand autistic life. So if you want some ideas, some lenses to take with you so that you can exercise your interruptive agency in how my autism community is understood, the first lens, if we're taking autistic joy seriously, it's going to change how we think about support. So I want to, so these lenses, take them with you. Go out. They might just be things that you're thinking about in your car, or depending on how you engage with the autism community, whether you're autistic yourself or not. I will encourage you to try to bring some of these with you into your work. So the first is recognizing the invisible labor that many autistic people are performing all the time. Much of what it takes to navigate the world as an autistic person is not always visible from the outside, but things like regulating sensory input and managing social interactions and masking and monitoring your environment, all of this requires a significant amount of energy. And that labor is often constant. And because it's invisible, it's frequently overlooked. So, though invisible, it has big consequences to our well-being. So if someone is expending a large amount of energy just to get through the day, then what looks like low performance might actually be the result of high effort. So this lens is inviting us to shift our focus, that instead of asking, what is this person producing? We might instead ask, what is this person expending? And from there, you can begin to think about support differently, not just in terms of improving performance, but in terms of supporting energy and sustainability and capacity. So the second lens builds on this idea and asks us to think not just about energy, but what we consider as meaningful in the first place. It asks us to take seriously the ways autistic people are experiencing joy and connection all the time. The autistic practices like deep focus or special interests and repetition and sensory exploration and sustained attention. I could go on about all the really fun things about being autistic. These are often viewed through a deficit lens, and they might be instead described as rigid and excessive and inappropriate. But when we look more closely at these practices, they often serve important functions. So they're regulating and they're grounding and they're deeply meaningful and they just plain feel good. And they can also be sources of creativity, connection, and joy. So this lens invites us to ask a different question, not how do we reduce or eliminate these behaviors, but what role do these practices play in this person's life? And when we begin to see these practices as meaningful rather than pathological, we start to shift our understanding of well-being. So well-being is no longer about how closely we're approximating a typical life, a productive life. It becomes about whether a person has access to the conditions that allow them to feel engaged and regulated and connected. I have this fear that my internet cut out at the start of this presentation, and I spent this whole time just talking to myself. I guess we'll find out real soon. So the third lens
That did not
shifts our
happen.
focus. Oh, thank goodness.
We are with you and we are happy that you are still with us.
Thank you for that reassurance. The third lens shifts our focus from individuals to environments. So instead of asking autistic people to continuously adapt to systems that are not designed for them, we can start to ask, how can we change environments? How are we changing the pinball machine? These things, this means thinking about things like sensory conditions, right? Like lighting and noise and space, and creating flexible communication practices. And in general, just seeing that there's not one right way to interact or participate. It means recognizing interdependence. The idea that people don't need to be fully independent to have a meaningful and valuable life. Because when environments are designed with flexibility and with care, the burden of constant adaptation is reduced. And that creates space not just for survival, but for well-being and joy, for flourishing, right? So when we bring all these lenses together, recognizing invisible labor, valuing autistic ways of being, and changing environments, we begin to move towards a different understanding of what it means to live well. So I want to return to the question that we started with. What makes life valuable? Earlier, we heard the claim that autistic lives might be defined by what they cannot do, that we cannot pay taxes and go on dates or write poems or play baseball. A life measured through absence, through lack, through failure to meet a very narrow idea of what life should look like. But when we look more closely, especially within autistic communities, we see something very different. We see creativity, we see connection, we see care, we see a lot of Lord of the Rings references, and we see a lot of joy. They might not be writing poems, they might be, but like honestly, it doesn't matter. Creating meanings in ways that may not fit conventional expectations, but are no less real. So autistic joy reminds us that flourishing does not require community conformity, and that worth cannot be reduced to productivity and independence and economic contribution, because the problem was never that autistic lives lack value, it's that the way that we're taught to see them is too narrow. And that's what I have for you today. I hope that I was gonna say wet your whistle, but maybe I'm not allowed to say that on public television. I hope that gave you something to think about. And ultimately, as you leave this presentation, if you're thinking more in your everyday life about what makes life worthy, and is that the way it should be, then I think that would be a great take-home message if I were you. So thank you all so much. I'm really happy to entertain questions.
Thank you so much. Just the visual of the flowers from wilted to flourishing is so hopeful. And I think, boy, if anyone leaves this presentation without a lot to think about, it is always good to be sort of challenged and reminded that in order to build a path forward, sometimes we have to step back and zoom out and look at what are the systems and the constructs and the beliefs for which we stand, and how do we need to change them, challenge them, resist them in order to build a world where well-being is truly accessible to all. And I think what I hear you saying loud and clear is not only do we have to stop with the deficit focused narrative and flip that script, but that it truly is going to take us all and hearing from autistic voices, listening to your stories, listening to your experiences, is absolutely necessary in this equation. Patricia, I don't know if we have questions from the audience, but
We
I,
do. There is one.
okay, good.
There's many comments about like yeah and all these other things and your storytelling magic and all those things. One of the questions we have is when did you start thinking about autistic joy?
Oh, right away. So I I so I was diagnosed with autism 2 days before my 34th birthday. And so that story at the beginning is me, but also not me, because that's completely the story of literally most autistic women. And I did the most autistic thing ever, which as soon as I thought I was autistic, I began researching autism. And through a lot of different spaces. So I did go to Google Scholar and start reading about myself from the research space. But I also went to online forums and Autism Edmonton, shout out if anybody from Autism Edmonton is here, and connecting with my autism community. And so that tension became so obvious to me literally immediately that when I was with my autism community, we didn't sit around talking about how ill we all are because we're stimming. Like we had like an autistic culture and shared humor, and those like co-productive spaces together brought so much joy. And then when I would read about every study that opens with the medical definition of autism, which is everything that we lack and suck at, and how in this study we compared 50 autistic people to 50 healthy people, and the language was so dehumanizing and objectifying. And even finding one incredible study that clearly shows that the vast majority of autism research is dehumanizing and objectifying, that tension, like literally within weeks of my diagnosis, I was like, how can it be that with my community this feels so different than how the rest of the world seems to talk about us, which is ultimately what encouraged me to get into my grad studies in the first place. So did that answer the question? Yeah, instantly
Did.
I was like, I love being autistic. Wait a second, there's more chatter going on about this too.
There's a few more questions, but I'm gonna choose one because then I know we're
Okay.
gonna time out well. And you gave a really nice intro. Is like, and someone just queried, are you studying autism for your PhD? How often do you see the systemic ableism and how do you address it within your program?
Oh, yes, I am studying autism within my PhD. I'm specifically looking at identity changes for late diagnosed autistic women. And I see this dialogue every single day that I'm working on my PhD because, of course, I'm rooted. My project is community based, so of course I'm responding to my community and folks from my advisory committee, but my work also has to have rigor, and I live within this system that I'm ultimately trying to change. And so literally I've participated in several scoping reviews that involves sifting through thousands of abstracts, and every single one, except for, I shouldn't say, 99% of them are talking about everything that we're so bad at. So it's exceptionally present every single day, and I get that really good reminder of why I'm doing this work in the first place.
Excellent. Katie, I'm going to jump to the next presenter while you close out. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all so much for coming. Yeah, thank you
This
for
is
putting on this special event. It's resistance.
small acts that reclaim life. Small acts that reclaim life. I sometimes say to Patricia that the skills of happiness, the same practices, the jolts of joy, the positivity portfolio, meditation, gratitude, connection with my community, when life is going according to plan, are what enable me to thrive and flourish. But it is those same practices, those same small acts that when life flips on its head and goes sideways, enable me to survive. And so I think these small acts that reclaim life for all of us are so important to remember that it
Mhm.
is the daily acts of joy as resistance, the daily acts of saying I am worthy of joy, I am worthy of being. And you reminded us of that today. And most certainly, I'm going to be sort of questioning the world through different lenses in my car and in my home and in life. So thank you for making us all think. Thank you for being here. And We are so excited that we get to continue to partner with you on the advisory board and learn with and from you and all of this great stuff. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'll see you all later.
Amazing. For those of you that are jumping to the next session, we are back to the lobby, and then we are going to be joined by Rick Gutierrez, who is working with the skills of happiness in the toughest of situations. He talks about thriving in crisis. So for those of you who may have been in crisis, who have supported folks through crisis, Rick has a really neat perspective of how even in the toughest of moments, we can shift and flip the lens. So thank you, Jessica, and hope to see everyone at Rick's presentation.